My name is Lapilo. On part 1, we covered some of the essential factors which underlie this period of our world's history, commonly called Cold War II. The innovation of the Chinese keju system, and the English constitutional democracy to give a hint of what the answer to the question, will China and Russia substitute the US and Europe to lead a new world order? Or will it be something different? Might be. If you haven't seen it, and you want a deeper understanding of this theme, I'd recommend watching part 1 first. Coming back to where we were, China and Russia see the West international liberal order as a threat to their regime's survival. But can they exit it and be successful? Assuming the US and Europe must deal with China and Russia, and vice versa as they are at present, the question posits itself: what would be of the best interest to all? A new order or a strengthening of the US lead order? To answer this question, we must of course see each side's perspective. The main contenders are the US and China, so let's look at what their relations should look like, considering history in China's best interest. On part 2, discussion on modernization, a look at the future of Sino-US relations from the historic lens of human civilization, from December 13th, 2018, Li Lu. A famous Sino American investor and former activist asks the following questions. How has China achieved such unprecedented growth under this current global order in the past 4 decades, and what problems must China confront now? Given the pressure she is now facing from the United States, what options does China have going forward? And what pitfalls must she avoid? What kind of relationship with the United States is best for her to maximize her own interests and help her achieve modernization in the end? Only when we answer these questions systematically can we clearly examine China's future, he writes. Li Lu's thought is quite peculiar but very interesting and resourceful. Let's take a deep dive into his thinking on Chinese and global history, highlighting the success of what became the Chinese keju system, which promoted meritocracy and ended the inheritance of political power, except for the emperors, and how it assured a strong governance of China and its unity for roughly 2,000 years, and contrasting it with the Roman Empire, which, although it impressively expanded and controlled the Mediterranean froal, satisfying its need for more arable land, due to its social structure, 1/3 of the population being slaves, was inherently unsustainable, having not been able to re-establish itself. He explains more than 1,000 years after the fall of the Roman Empire, small nation-states of the original empire and emerging vassal states in northern Europe were still in the midst of various wars. There was still no unified empire in the West. The European medieval period was very similar to the Spring and Autumn period, and the Warring States period, 770 BC to 221 BC in China. However, when considering the 2,000 years history of the stable Chinese empire, since the Qin and Han dynasties as a whole, one can certainly see a clear divergence between Eastern and Western civilizations. At that time, it was China that stood at the apex of agrarian civilization, because of her institutional innovations and political organization. He goes on to explain that, after 1500 AD, developments in the East and the West saw another great divergence. This set the history of Europe and China after the Spring and Autumn period and the Warring States periods on completely different paths, with the starting point marked by the Age of Discovery. Advancement in sailing and navigation technology enabled the discovery of the New World. The Europeans landed on the shores of the Americas, largely by chance, and the Atlantic was to Europe as the Mediterranean was to the Roman Empire. By way of a cheaper mode of transportation, sailing, Europe quickly took over the largest agricultural plains on Earth, North America and South America. The Europeans were quick to take over these vast American plains so suited to growing crops. Through their American colonies, these European states could access granaries substantially larger than those of the central plains of China, leading to a tremendous burst of sustained economic growth. In agrarian civilization, if an economy followed the normal course of progress, it would grow until it fell into the Malthusian trap. But the West's fall into this trap was preempted by another epochal event, the scientific and technological revolution. The Age of Discovery not only brought material wealth to the peoples of Europe, but also generated a strong curiosity in science and technology, thus triggering ideological and spiritual revolution. Europe underwent a fundamental transformation from the Renaissance, the Protestant Reformation, to the Enlightenment. That was the historic context in which scientific revolution was born. Multiple factors such as scientific revolution, transatlantic free trade, an autonomous American continent, and competition among European feudal states, together brought about great advances in human civilization. The scientific revolution and free market economy emerged right around the same time, and that combination resulted in hundreds of years of sustained and compounded economic growth, which finally allowed the economy to break through the bottleneck of agrarian civilization. And land itself was no longer a constraint on economic growth. This period saw exponential economic growth that was fully capable of supporting any level of population growth. In fact, we still have not seen the upper limit of such growth even today. It was then that mankind ushered in the era of modern sci-tech civilization. This era has been marked by unlimited and sustained compound economic growth driven by the dual engines of modern science and technology and the free market. In a free market, people willingly exchange products and services benefiting both parties such that one is greater than two. When knowledge is exchanged, both sides gain from the other without losing what it had to start, sparking a multiplier effect such that one is greater than four. So when science and technology know-how is used to make products and services and then exchanged on the free market, a lasting, mutually reinforcing virtuous cycle is created. The insatiability of human needs and desires fuels the never-ending innovation and delivery of new products and services. The bigger the market, the more efficient it is. The more efficient the market is, the more needs are met. The more these original needs are met, the more demand is created. A self-sustaining virtuous growth cycle ensues. This is known in economics as compounding. When everyone has access to science and technology and free market, competition is reduced to and centered around the size of the market. Relatively speaking, bigger markets are more efficient markets have greater capacity, and greater capacity means larger economies. These larger economies can sustain stronger military, making it easier for them to win over their competitors. The shift from competing for land to competing for markets reflects the transition from agrarian civilization to modern sci-tech civilization. This is exactly the shifting tide that we have been witnessing for the past 500 years. In the beginning, Europe was still living in the agrarian civilization, and the various feudal states were still waging wars over land and fighting over territory. But gradually, all of these warring states began to break free of the constraints of the land itself and discovered new drivers for economic growth. Participants in the economy were no longer only aristocrats or plebeians. Businessmen, capitalists, new classes of industrialists, and consumers emerged as active participants in the economy. As economies crossed over from agrarian civilization to modern sci-tech civilization, political structures and people's demands changed too. In this new era, old rivalries among European countries quickly turned into competition for colonies. Market size was what colonial powers were interested in, and colonies were a good source of raw materials, markets, and labor. As the first real global empire, the British Empire's most important contribution to a new world order was its global free market system that included its own colonies that ran on its own currency, the pound sterling. This market system gave her a decisive competitive advantage over other major powers. So early on in the transition from agrarian civilization to modern sci-tech civilization, European countries were waging wars of colonial aggression abroad and wars among rivals at home, both in the interest of colonial expansion. Land and markets were both at the center of it all. As economic progress accelerated during the transition from agrarian civilization to modern sci-tech civilization, rival European powers began searching for the best type of political system for the new era, and that process produced a series of institutional innovations. By the 20th century, three different camps had emerged: fascism as practiced by Germany, Japan, and Italy, communism under the leadership of the Soviet Union, and liberalism led by the United States and Great Britain. In the nearly 100 years of conflicts and wars that followed, first to fall was fascism at the end of World War II, and next came communism, the end of the Cold War. By the early 1990s, liberalism had won a resounding victory. The United States emerged as the legitimate single superpower in the New World Order, ushering in a new era of the American order, and marking the end of the previous era. Today's global market is dominated and governed by the American order. In Lai Luan discussion of modernization, he argues that the ironclad rule of modern sci-tech civilization is that the biggest market will eventually become the only market that matters. Other standalone markets will be relatively inefficient and unable to compete, so the American-led market is the only one that matters. Therefore, access to this market determines which countries will prosper and which countries will live in poverty. The US holds that key. In his memoirs, Li Zhenji, counselor and translator to Chinese leaders, recounts what Deng Xiaoping said about Sino-US relations while en route on a visit to the US. It was Deng's first official visit to the United States after his return to power. Deng said the reason for attaching such great importance to the relations was based on his observation that in the post-war era, countries who aligned themselves with the US had all become rich, whereas those who sided with the Soviet Union had stayed poor. This observation is still relevant today, and is an accurate description of the present global order. Today, some people in China hold the view that Chinese economy has become too big to hide, and Deng's strategy of coolly observe, calmly deal with things, hold your position, hide your capacities, bide your time, and accomplish things where possible will no longer work. They believe that the US will no longer stand by and allow the Chinese economy to continue to grow. At the same time, they argue that the Chinese political system won't change, which means conflicts with the US are inevitable, and the two countries are destined for war in the future. It follows that the best policy option, given all that, is to take advantage of the current situation and establish a China-led international trading system, with a view to competing with and eventually replacing the American-led system. This view misreads and misjudges both the American order and China's powers home and abroad. Economically, under the American order, there is a free, competitive global market that provides a level playing field for every member of the WTO. Since the end of WWII, Germany and Japan, both erstwhile enemies of the United States, have developed into major economies accounting for 5% and 6% of the world's GDP respectively. Since the reforms and open-door policy, China's share of the global GDP has risen from 1.75% to 16%. The American order has made all this possible, but the US has seen its share of global GDP drop from about 50% at the end of WWII to 25% today, while shouldering most of the costs in maintaining the smooth operations of this global market. So generally speaking, the American order has been basically generous and fair. No WTO member really wants to leave the trading system. As long as China abides by its rules, there is still plenty of room for growth. At present, the United States still has the most dynamic economy in the world, and it remains confident about its competitiveness. To challenge the existing world order, a nation not only has to be strong at home, but more importantly needs a set of ideologies that is widely accepted by the global community. Judging by how well the China dream has been received by the Chinese people, China is not quite there yet, and doesn't have the necessary soft power. Politically, under the American order, every nation has free rein to develop as it wishes. The American order is mainly preoccupied with the rules of access to and exit from the global market. It doesn't wield much power over other nations' political choices. The UN Charter states the organization is based on the principle of sovereign equality of all its members. So in fact, under the American order, different political systems may develop, provided that they do not directly challenge America's superpower status. The rapid growth of China's share of global GDP from less than 2% to 16% is proof of this. Indeed, there is plenty of room for sustained growth. In modern sci-tech civilization, economic development is not necessarily tied to a certain political structure. As a nation's economy develops, its political system also evolves. In the early stages of economic development, almost all nations have a relatively centralized political system. Even those who chose democracy chose a republic form of constitutional democracy. For example, at the time of Industrial Revolution, Britain was a constitutional monarchy. In order to establish a global market, it relied on colonial expansion. Those were times of bloody politics. During the early stages of America's economic development, less than 10% of American citizens even had the right to vote. The US was not a colonial power, but it was the largest country to have slavery at that time. Japan, Germany, and other countries chose even more destructive paths, such as fascism and foreign aggression at the early stages in their development. The good news is, with economic development and improving living standards, major Western countries have gradually embarked on a path to constitutionalism, democracy, human rights, and freedom. This process of political evolution is the effect rather than the cause of economic development in the era of modern sci-tech civilization. For this reason, the US has not placed any hard and fast rules on the political system of developing countries, respecting the sovereignty of all individual nations. All members are equal at the United Nations, and there is no inherent discrimination against China. If China can seize this opportunity, playing by and not challenging the global market rules of the American order, the potential for economic growth is still huge, and the Thucydides trap can be avoided. Based on this analysis, Li Lu goes on, the appropriate policy option is to stay on the course charted by Deng. In building a new model for relations between major countries, China must try to escape the Thucydides trap by avoiding directly challenging the US, by respecting the US as the superpower of modern sci-tech civilization, and by playing by the rules. Economically, China should continue her market liberalization efforts, promoting a more market-oriented and open economy, carry out ZOE reforms, move from managing assets to managing capital, and driving domestic demand, so that China can make due contributions to the global economy. Internationally, China should bear the cost of maintaining the global market commensurate with her 16% share of global GDP by supporting American-led international organizations. In this regard, China's response to the 2008-09 global financial crisis was exemplary. Domestically, China introduced a stimulus package worth 4 trillion RMB, or 600 billion USD, implemented a series of stimulus measures, and contributed to half of the world's economic growth in 2008. Internationally, China purchased hundreds of billions of US treasuries in support of US monetary policy. Joining the American initiative to set up the G20, China and other major economies introduced coordinated monetary and fiscal policies, stemmed the spread of the financial crisis, and averted the repeat of the Great Depression of the 1930s. During the crisis, China acted as a responsible stakeholder and was lauded by the international community. The American order itself is also a work in progress. Economically and militarily, the order is strong. The latter is strong. The latter is enforced through some selective military alliances, such as NATO, US-Japan, US-South Korea, and other security alliances, as well as military bases across the globe. Politically, the order mainly relies on soft power. The UN respects the sovereign equality of its members and recognizes the sovereignty, freedom, and equality of each nation. Even when a nation is subject to economic sanctions, it is still politically independent. The arrangements between the US and its allies, including European countries, Five Eye countries, Japan, South Korea, and others, are somewhat similar to a loose confederation. The European Union is a more mature confederate system. In the long run, the ironclad rule of modern sci-tech civilization is that the largest market will eventually become the only market. Even countries such as Iran and North Korea, which are excluded from this market and may reject American values, still have to kowtow to the US dollar. If a single global market is inevitable, then all countries will converge politically. It is conceivable that countries will grow tighter politically in the coming decades or centuries. Today's global challenges will make this eventuality more likely. Global challenges such as climate change have no national borders and require a global response. It is especially true that rapidly developing countries need to take action. To convince other nations of her world leadership, China must step up to the plate and act responsibly. The rapid development of science and technology presents new challenges to the current economic order, including the impact of artificial intelligence on employment, gene editing, biotechnology, and the IT revolution. China could help address these common challenges. In addition, there is the threat of nuclear weapons. No country can tolerate the risk of a nuclear war, but one might ensue as a result of rivalry among major powers. All these challenges provide China with plenty of space to develop within the bounds of the existing global system. On the contrary, if China were to change it forcibly and try to displace the US as the superpower, the consequences would almost certainly be catastrophic. Presently, China has many problems of her own, dealing simultaneously with the middle-income trap at home and the Thucydides trap abroad. To solve the domestic problems, China must continue to grow its economy. If the problems are handled properly, then they will just be part of her growing pains. If not, they may morph into something entirely different and lead China right into the middle-income trap. To escape this trap and grow into an advanced economy, China is absolutely dependent on the American-led global market under the American order. Broadly speaking, we still live under the American order, one that is still evolving and hasn't yet arrived at its final destination. Socio-political systems and economic development of China and many other countries in the world are still at the transitional stage of civilization 2.5 between agrarian civilization and modern sci-tech civilization. In this sense, history has not ended. A highly unified market will also bring countries and peoples closer socially and politically. As to what final form it may take in federation or federation, loose or tightly structured, it is hard to predict. Nevertheless, the existing socio-political structures are the products of agrarian civilization, and it is not clear whether they will be applicable to modern sci-tech civilization. Whatever the case may be, each country has the flexibility to design and build its own political system. China, having built the best political structure for agrarian civilization, arguably was the first country to have achieved equitable distribution of political power until then. It behooves China to keep this political tradition when transitioning to modern sci-tech civilization. The United States, having created the global order in modern sci-tech civilization, stands at its pinnacle. China, building on our own experiences and learning from American experiences, must strive to achieve the following three key objectives: avoiding the Thucydides trap, escaping the middle income trap, and shouldering her proportional share of the cost of maintaining the global market. The ultimate goal of these endeavors is to realize the comprehensive modernization of China. To further understand why Li Lu's belief that the biggest market will be the only market, he adds that the contest between paths of development in 20th century provides a vivid illustration of this law. At one point, the market of the Soviet Union and Warsaw Pact was very large. But because it was not a free market mechanism, its efficiency was much lower than that of the US and of the common market which was established in post-war Europe. Within the short span of 30 years, the entire Soviet system fell farther and farther behind the mainstream global markets. It ultimately lost the Cold War and was forced to join the larger global market. Another example was China, which in the Mao era adopted policies of self-reliance and isolationism. It finally joined the global market in the open door era after humiliation economic failures. Other good negative examples are the economic performances of countries like Iran, Myanmar, and Cuba, after they were subjected to international economic sanctions and forced out of the international common market. Let us also contemplate that suppose Germany had won WWII and established another European economic system dominated by state capitalism. I doubt, he goes on, that it would have fared much better due to the absence of a free market mechanism, despite its otherwise large size. It would therefore have been difficult for science and technology to seamlessly integrate with the market, and there would not have been the process of constant self-improvement found in the American and British markets. With the passage of time, the final outcome might have been similar to that of the Soviet Union and Warsaw Pact. According to this point of view, China and Russia will be better off help maintain American order in the US-led global market, rather than trying to dethrone the US and risk a great power war. There are widely different opinions on what the current global tendencies are, and what should or shouldn't be done in order to serve each side's interest. For instance, Stephen Kotkin and John Mearsheimer have opposite opinions on the Ukraine war. Not in a moral sense, but in a strategic sense. Mearsheimer believes the West is to blame for having provoked Russia with NATO expansion, noting that since 2008, when Georgia and Ukraine's adherence was being discussed, Putin had been warning it would have dire consequences, while Kotkin highlights the lack of compromise from the Kremlin to stand by its promises on treaties where it recognized Ukraine's sovereignty as their general practice, and that the US international order simply cannot accept such a violation of international law, while recognizing that what the US did in Iraq was illegal too, and has done other mistakes in the past. The truth is often in the middle. The perspective given by Liu offers an extremely powerful and positive insight into what can benefit all. National identity and unity are often enhanced by a common threat, so identified under more or less independent pretext from the proponent's selfish interest. This can be another country, a minority, to blame an attack, or some kind of goal, such as avoiding mutually assured destruction, economic collapse, poverty, and chaos. It is common in realism, the international relations theory, to understand that the rule of law is only effective domestically, and that internationally it's not the rules that govern how states interact with each other, but it is the relative power each state has. While diplomatic negotiation generally depends on the balance of power, this is because domestically the state holds the monopoly of violence, while internationally the closest we have is the US, especially during the unipolar moment, accentuated between the 1990s and the late 2010s. We are no longer in this unipolar moment, and it seems like international liberalism is starting to fade. However, as Leilu points out, free market economies with free speech are better positioned to compound economic growth, develop science and technology, and, along with their partners, will in the end be much more efficient than state-led economies. So according to this point of view, although the US is no longer the only superpower, it is, nevertheless, not only every country's best interest to further integrate the present world order, but also the only viable option.
Thank you for tuning in. If you enjoyed this content, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with your people.